In 1924, a single foundation quietly began writing checks to almost every anthropology department in the United States. Not one or two universities, nearly all of them. The money came with no scandal, no headlines, no dramatic announcement, just funding, generous and steady, flowing into the exact academic field that decides how we understand our own past. And within a single decade, something strange happened. The questions students were once encouraged to ask began to disappear from the lecture halls. Certain buildings, certain ruins, certain anomalies that had filled textbooks in the 1800s were suddenly treated as settled, closed, not worth a second look. Today we are going to follow that money. We are going to look at what the curriculum contained before 1924 and what quietly vanished after. Because the story of who funds knowledge is the story of who controls it. Before we go any further, if you are the kind of person who refuses to take the official version at face value, do this channel a favor right now. Subscribe and turn on the bell. We dig into the parts of history that someone somewhere decided you were better off forgetting. Your subscription keeps this research going, and it tells the algorithm that people still want the truth. Now let us begin. To understand why 1924 matters, you first have to understand what American universities looked like in the century before it. In the 1800s, the study of the human past was wild, open, and deeply competitive. Anthropology was not yet a locked profession with a single approved storyline. It was a frontier. Amateur scholars, surveyors, geologists, and self-taught antiquarians published their findings in journals that the public actually read. Newspapers carried reports of strange discoveries almost weekly. Giant skeletons pulled from burial mounds, cities of earthworks stretching across the Ohio Valley that no living tribe claimed to have built. Coins, tools, and inscriptions found at depths that should have been impossible if the accepted timeline was correct. The Smithsonian itself, in its early annual reports, catalogued findings that today would never survive peer review. Mounds containing skeletons far taller than any normal human. Copper artifacts in regions where no copper working culture was supposed to exist. Whole categories of evidence that pointed to a North America far older and far stranger than the simple story of nomadic hunters crossing a land bridge. And here is the key point. None of this was fringe at the time. It was mainstream. It was printed in respectable journals and discussed by serious men. The past was treated as an open question, and the people studying it were not yet dependent on a single source of money to keep their jobs. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Generosity. A self-made man giving back to the country that made him rich. But money at that scale is never neutral. When a single source funds the libraries, the universities, the research councils, and the professional associations all at once, that source gains something far more valuable than gratitude. It gains influence over what counts as knowledge. By the 1920s, the major American foundations had developed a method. They did not crudely censor. They did something quieter and far more effective. They funded the people in the projects they approved of, and they simply did not fund the rest. A young scholar with unconventional ideas was not arrested or silenced. He just never received the grant. He never got the position. His rival, the one who stayed inside the approved boundaries, got the salary, the laboratory, the prestige. Over a single generation, this selects for obedience without ever needing to ban a single idea. In 1924, this machinery turned its attention fully toward anthropology, and the timing is worth sitting with. This was the same decade in which the discipline was being professionalized, standards were being written, the boundary between a real anthropologist and a mere enthusiast was being drawn for the first time. And the people drawing that boundary were increasingly the same people who controlled the funding. To get the credential, you had to study under the approved professors. To study under them, you had to accept the approved framework. The gate and the gatekeeper had become the same thing. If this is making you rethink how settled history really is, do me one quick favour before we continue. Hit that like button. It genuinely helps this video reach other people who are asking the same questions you are. And drop a comment with the word truth so I know you made it this far. Now let us look at what actually changed. So what disappeared from the curriculum after the money arrived? The first casualty was the giant. For most of the 1800s, the existence of unusually large human remains in the burial mounds of North America was treated as an open archaeological fact. Reports came from dozens of states recorded by county officials, doctors, and the Smithsonian's own field agents. Then, within the span of a few decades, the topic simply evaporated from serious study. The bones were said to be lost, miscatalogued, or misidentified. The reports were reclassified as exaggeration or fraud. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. The open question was simple. Who built them and when? After the professionalization of the field, that question was closed with surprising speed. The new official answer flattened thousands of years of complexity into a tidy narrative, and the more troubling details, the precision, the scale, the astronomical alignments, the artifacts that did not fit, were quietly set aside as distractions. Take just one detail that the new orthodoxy preferred to bury. Some of the largest earthworks contained interior chambers, face stone, and engineering that implied not a single primitive culture, but a long sequence of builders working over centuries toward a unified plan. Early surveyors described drainage systems, sightlines tuned to the solstice, and proportions that echoed the sacred geometry of the Old World. Once the funding regime took hold, these observations were not disproven so much as ignored. The official story needed the mounds to be simple, so the inconvenient measurements were filed away, and the next generation of students was never shown them at all. The third casualty cuts even deeper, and it sits at the very heart of the Tartaria question. It is the problem of architecture that does not match its supposed builders. Across North America stand structures of staggering ambition. Grand exposition halls, domed capitals, immense stone buildings raised in frontier towns that, according to the official record, barely had the population, the machinery, or the time to build them. The great world's fairs displayed entire cities of palatial buildings supposedly thrown up in a year or two and then deliberately torn down. Before 1924, the origins and methods of such construction were a legitimate subject of inquiry. Afterward, curiosity about them was gently steered away from the anthropology department and into the safer, narrower world of art history, where the only acceptable questions were about style, never about who or how, or whether the timeline itself made sense. Consider the star forts, those vast geometric fortifications with their perfect points radiating outward, found on nearly every continent, and built, we are told, by dozens of unconnected cultures who somehow arrived at the identical advanced design. Consider the strange uniformity of the grand old buildings themselves. The same domes, the same columns, the same ornate stonework appearing in cities that had no contact with one another, raised in a few short years by populations that, on paper, were tiny and worn down from settling a frontier. A curious mind looks at that uniformity and asks whether these structures share a common origin that predates the official builders entirely. The professionalized field of the 1920s was trained never to ask that. It learned to attribute every wonder to coincidence, to forgotten genius, or to revival styles, and to treat anyone who pointed at the larger pattern as a crank unworthy of a degree. Do you see the pattern? Each removed topic shared one feature. Each one, if pursued honestly, threatened the simple, linear story of human progress that the institutions had decided to enforce. A story in which civilization marches steadily upward from primitive to modern, with no resets, no lost golden ages, no advanced cultures, erased and rewritten. The giants did not fit that story. The mound builders did not fit it. The impossible architecture did not fit it. So the funding flowed toward the scholars who explained the anomalies away, and it dried up for anyone who insisted on looking closer. This is where the Tartaria framework becomes useful, not as a finished answer, but as a lens. The core Tartaria idea is simple and unsettling. What if there was once a far more advanced and far more widespread civilization than the official timeline allows? What if much of what we call old construction is actually the inheritance of that lost world, reassigned to later, smaller, poorer societies who merely occupied the ruins? And what if the very institutions we trust to study the past were captured at a specific moment by the people with the most to gain from keeping that question buried? Look at the timeline again. The grand buildings rise in the 1800s and very early 1900s. The great fairs display their impossible cities and then demolish them. And then, in 1924, the money arrives, the discipline locks its doors, and the awkward questions fade from the syllabus within a generation. You do not have to accept every claim of the Tartaria movement to find that sequence of events deeply suspicious. The pattern of capture is documented. The flow of foundation money into universities is a matter of public record. The narrowing of acceptable inquiry is something every honest academic has felt. And the Carnegie money did not act alone. It moved in coordination with the other great fortunes of the age, the Rockefeller boards, the Peabody, and the rest, which together funded the universities, the medical schools, the teacher colleges, and the research councils as a single connected system. The same names that reshaped American medicine in those years, standardizing it and closing the schools they disapproved of, were reshaping the study of the past with the very same method. When a handful of foundations agree on what a field should look like, and they control the salaries, the grants, the journals, and the accreditation all at once, dissent does not need to be forbidden. It simply starves. A scholar can hold any opinion he likes in private. He just cannot hold it and keep his career. Over 20 years, that pressure does not bend a discipline. It rebuilds it from the foundation up until the people inside no longer remember that other questions were once allowed. Now, the official explanation for all of this is straightforward, and it deserves a fair hearing. The mainstream answer is that anthropology in the 1800s was simply immature. It was full of racism, wishful thinking, hoaxes, and bad method, and the professionalization of the 1920s was a necessary cleanup. The giants were frauds. The mound builders were the ancestors of known tribes. The grand architecture was the ordinary product of skilled labor and forgotten craftsmanship. In this telling, the foundations were not censors. They were patrons of progress, and the topics that vanished deserved to vanish. That explanation might be completely true. But notice what it asks of you. It asks you to trust that the people who controlled the money also happened to be the people who were simply correct, every single time, on every contested question. It asks you to believe that an entire field reformed itself toward truth at the exact moment it became financially dependent on a handful of industrial fortunes. And it asks you to ignore the most basic principle of any honest investigation. Follow the money and ask who benefits. The men who built those fortunes did not become powerful by being naive about how influence works. They understood that whoever defines the past defines the limits of what a people will imagine for their future. A nation taught that it climbed slowly out of the dirt with nothing remarkable behind it is a nation that will not go looking for what it lost. That is not a small thing to control. It may be the most valuable thing of all. What is not in dispute is this. In 1924, the funding arrived, the discipline closed ranks, and a long list of questions that had once been open became, almost overnight, things that serious people no longer asked. Whether that was the triumph of science or the quiet purchase of an entire field is the question they would prefer you never consider. So here is what I want to leave you with. The next time you are told that a historical question is settled, ask yourself a simple thing. Settled by whom, and who paid for the settling? Because knowledge does not police itself. It is funded, shaped, and gated by people with interests. And the moment we forget, that is the moment we stop being able to see clearly. Now I want to hear from you. Do you believe the cleanup of the 1920s was honest science finally correcting its mistakes? Or do you believe it was the moment our shared past was quietly locked away behind a wall of foundation money? Tell me in the comments, and be specific, because the best discoveries in this community come from you. If this video gave you something to think about, subscribe, share it with one person who still believes the textbook, and I will see you in the next investigation.